Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today we will dive into the most terrible and inhumane experiments carried out during World War II. These horrible experiments will send shivers down your spines, from nerve transplantation experiments to sterilization and fertility experiments. Make sure to watch till the end, and if you are new, hit that subscribe button. So grab your snacks and let's get started. Bone, muscle, and nerve transplantation experiments. From about September 1942 to about December 1943, experiments were conducted at the Ravensbrück concentration camp for the benefit of the German armed forces to study bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration and bone transplantation from one person to another. In these experiments, subjects had their bones, muscles, and nerves removed without anesthesia. As a result of these operations, many victims suffered intense agony, mutilation, and permanent disability. On the 12th of August 1946, a survivor named Jadwiga Kaminska gave a deposition about her time at Ravensbrück concentration camp, describing how she was operated on twice. Both operations involved one of her legs, and although she never describes herself as having any knowledge as to what exactly the procedure was, she explained that both times she was in extreme pain and developed a fever post-surgery, but was given little to no aftercare. Kaminska describes being told that she had been operated on simply because she was a young girl and a Polish patriot. She describes how her leg oozed pus for months after the operations. Prisoners were also experimented on by having their bone marrow injected with bacteria to study the effectiveness of new drugs being developed for use in the battlefields. Those who survived remained permanently disfigured. High-altitude experiments. In early 1942, prisoners at Dachau concentration camp were used by Sigmund Rascher in experiments to aid German pilots who had to eject at high altitudes. A low-pressure chamber containing these prisoners was used to simulate conditions at altitudes of up to 68,000 feet, 21,000 m. It was rumored that Rascher performed vivisections on the brains of victims who survived the initial experiment. Of the 200 subjects, 80 died outright, and the others were murdered. In a letter from the 5th of April 1942 between Rascher and Heinrich Himmler, Rascher explains the results of a low-pressure experiment that was performed on people at Dachau concentration camp, in which the victim was suffocated, while Rascher and another unnamed doctor took note of his reactions. The person was described as 37 years old and in good health before being murdered. Rascher described the victim's actions as he began to lose oxygen and timed the changes in behavior. The 37-year-old began to wiggle his head at 4 minutes. A minute later, Rascher observed that he was suffering from cramps before falling unconscious. He describes how the victim then lay unconscious, breathing only 3 times per minute, until he stopped breathing 30 minutes after being deprived of oxygen. The victim then turned blue and began foaming at the mouth. An autopsy followed an hour later. In a letter from Himmler to Rascher, on the 13th of April 1942, Himmler ordered Rascher to continue the high-altitude experiments and to continue experimenting on prisoners condemned to death and to determine whether these men could be recalled to life. If a victim could be successfully resuscitated, Himmler ordered that he be pardoned to concentration camp for life. Sterilization and fertility experiments. From about March 1941 to about January 1945, sterilization experiments were conducted at Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and other places. The purpose of these experiments was to develop a method of sterilization which would be suitable for sterilizing millions of people with a minimum of time and effort. The targets for sterilization included Jewish and Roma populations. These experiments were conducted by means of X-ray, surgery, and various drugs. Thousands of victims were sterilized. Sterilization was not limited to these experiments, with the Nazi government already sterilizing 400,000 people as part of its compulsory sterilization program. One prominent scientist in this domain was Karl Klauberg, who initially X-rayed women to make sure that there was no obstruction to their ovaries. Over the next 3 to 5 sessions, he injected caustic substances into their uteruses without anesthetics. Many died, others suffered permanent injuries and infections, and about 700 were successfully sterilized. The women who stood against him and his experiments or were deemed as unfit test subjects were sent to the gas chambers. Intravenous injections of solutions speculated to contain iodine and silver nitrate were similarly successful, but had unwanted side effects such as vaginal bleeding, severe abdominal pain, and cervical cancer. Those who received cancer were vivisected, with their cervixes and wombs removed. Therefore, radiation treatment became the favored choice of sterilization. Specific amounts of exposure to radiation destroyed a person's ability to produce OVA or sperm, sometimes administered through deception. Many suffered severe radiation burns. The Nazis also implemented X-ray radiation treatment in their search for mass sterilization. They gave the women abdomen X-rays. Men received them on their genitalia for abnormal periods of time in an attempt to invoke infertility. After the experiment was complete, they surgically removed their reproductive organs without anesthesia for lab analysis. Other experiments. In mid-1942 in Baranowicz, occupied Poland, head injury experiments were conducted in a small building behind the private home occupied by a known Nazi SD security service officer, in which a young boy of 11 or 12 was strapped to a chair so he could not move. Above him was a mechanized hammer that every few seconds came down upon his head. The boy was driven insane from the torture. Inmates were also subjected to various diseases which were given in the form of injections. At the German concentration camps of Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Natzweiler, Buchenwald, and Neuengamme, scientists tested immunization compounds and serums for the prevention and treatment of contagious diseases, including malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, yellow fever, and infectious hepatitis. From about February 1942 to about April 1945, malaria experiments were performed on over 1,200 inmates in Dachau concentration camp. Healthy inmates had their hands and arms confined in cages filled with malaria mosquitoes. Upon contracting the disease, they were treated with synthetic drugs at doses ranging from high to lethal. More than half died as a result. Other inmates were left with permanent disabilities. In an affidavit presented at the doctor's trial, Oswald Pohl called the Dachau malaria experiments the largest experiment and reported it as the cause for his protest to Heinrich Himmler against such experiments because Schilling continually asked for prisoners. From June 1943 until January 1945 at the concentration camps, Sachsenhausen and Natzweiler, experimentation with epidemic jaundice viral hepatitis was conducted. Test subjects were injected with the disease in order to discover new inoculations for the condition. These tests were conducted for the benefit of the German armed forces. Most died in the experiments, whilst others survived, experiencing great pain and suffering.